stand. I call to order this hearing of the Europe, Eurasian, and Emerging Threats Subcommittee. The topic for this afternoon's hearing is the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union and to understand better where those negotiations currently stand. The Brexit vote represents a self-determination of the British people. It reflects an inherent desire of people to control their own destiny rather than be under the domination of another country or another group of countries. Around the world, populations are increasingly seeking to exercise their right of self-determination. When done peacefully through the ballot box, such as what happened in the United Kingdom, and I might add, in the United Kingdom, as happened to Scotland, I believe the world would be a much better place if people were allowed to make that choice in that peaceful manner. After 40 years of membership in the EU and its predecessor organizations, the British people voted last year by a clear margin to end that membership. It has set the UK on a course which I guess would be in March of 2019 for exit. Between now and that date, a wide variety of issues remain to be resolved. Many speculate that the major pieces of the transition must be set far ahead of that date in order to allow industry and business to adapt to the new rules. Both sets of negotiation and the negotiating teams appear to be dedicated to approaching their task with goodwill, but the breadth and complexity of the challenges would be imposing and on any group of people trying to find those type of solutions. While I have great sympathy for those in Britain who want to return political power from Brussels to London and believe that the EU countries, there probably are other EU countries who want to follow their lead. But whatever decision people make in terms of their own self-determination, clearly Americans have friends on both sides of this issue and are inclined to support people who are longing for their freedom and representative government. As my colleagues and I get into this discussion with the panelists, I especially want to talk about Ireland and learn what progress has been made to ensure there will be no hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. The return to a hard border, I fear, would be a needless blow to the peace process that has achieved so much in that part of the world over the last few decades. The United States is, of course, not a party to the Brexit negotiations, but we do have a keen interest in what the outcome of those negotiations will come up with. I hope to learn from our witnesses how the United States Congress can play a positive and constructive role as both sides work to establish a new relationship. I also want to recognize that several members of the Irish Parliament are with us today, and we welcome you. And let me just say this thing, I have a special place in my heart for Ireland. I learned all about the real political facts of life from the greatest Irish-American president, Ronald Reagan, with whom I spoke and met and worked with for 7.5 years of my life in the White House. So it's a pleasure to have you here with us. And let us also note, my staff didn't put this in my notes, but let us also note that the Irish were really, beside the Americans, were the first ones to strike a blow for self-determination. And we're happy that their former British landlords now have learned the lesson and are now establishing their own self-determination in Europe. So welcome aboard. And thanks to our witnesses. And without objection, all the members will have 5 legislative days to submit any written questions for you. I would appreciate if you would basically limit your testimony to 5 minutes each, and then it'll open up for the members to ask what questions they have, and we can have a dialogue. With that said, I recognize my ranking member, Mr. Meeks, and who we work together very well, and this shows you just how people can work together with various different points of view. I'm saying that for my Irish parliamentarians over there.
Indeed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you also for calling this timely conversation on the Brexit negotiations. To be honest, I see the Brexit process as a lose, lose, lose situation. The UK, the EU, and the United States, in other words, the West, will take an economic and political hit. Of course, there may be small pockets of economic winners, joined by cultural elites who will benefit. The vote did reflect real grievances with the status quo. America, meanwhile, is losing its closest ideological ally in the European Union and the influence that came with it in Great Britain. Many were made to believe that Brexit negotiations would be simple, that the EU would succumb to the British demands, and a global Britain would emerge, ready to strike trade deals and still be able to set rules and standards at home. In the past weeks, though, reality is beginning to bite. More specifically, the Northern Ireland question, something my colleagues on both sides of the aisle care deeply about, is unresolved. The Good Friday Agreement, a delicate consensus that we helped foster, is at risk. The essential question for the Irish government, and they have the backing of the EU with their veto, just as every member state does. And this is just one example of the seemingly countless hurdles in the negotiations that must end in March of 2019. That is, unless there's a transition period or an extension is agreed upon. The March 2019 deadline was imposed by the UK when it triggered Article 50, thereby starting the 2-year clock. Other red lines were perhaps prematurely set early, such as the refusal to entertain the customs union as an option, done without considering the economic consequences. Much of the Prime Minister's government, including the Prime Minister herself, campaigned to remain. These questions are all related, are complicated, and the EU is negotiating from a unified position with a weak partner government, not sure about what it wants. In the realm of bilateral US-UK trade, we learned in our February hearing that there's not much to gain, nor is it clear when we could even start negotiating, given the practical constraints. The potential gains are either not there, already exhausted, or protected. In reality, the UK would be coming to American negotiators looking for a deal, any deal, and our negotiations would look to extract the best deal for America. So what does this mean for the special relationship? Reckless, hateful tweets from our president aside, and with the help of delicious British imports, we will carry on. Our histories and our political ties are stronger than that. We will continue to work closely with the UK in NATO and encourage the UK to continue to support sanctions in the Kremlin. In the Brexit negotiations, as highlighted by Prime Minister May in Philadelphia, a close relationship with a strong EU is in both America's and the UK's interests. In that spirit, I hope the UK and the EU remain very close partners that we, the United States, can count on and cooperate with. I encourage both sides to avoid the cliff edge, no deal scenario. Come back to reality and compromise where possible. There are forces driving Brexit that would like to see the transatlantic relationship unravel. But we need each other today more than ever to protect the values we fought for together in the 20th century. It is more important now that the West stays together and does not allow us to be divided, for it is our values today in a collective way that can lead the rest in a world that is more interconnected and globalized than ever. And we may want or think that globalization, some may like it and some may not, But globalization is here, and I think that we need to utilize it to bring us closer together, set standards together, and lead together from the West so that others can follow. And with that, I yield back.
Oh. Thanks very much, and I guess you can see where there is a difference between Republicans and Democrats on this. Just glad that the French decided to side with self-determination for our side rather than back up the British. Ms. Kelly, please feel free.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding a hearing on the developments of the Brexit negotiations. Given the issues earlier this week in the negotiations, it's a particularly relevant time for this hearing. Time is passing quickly and pressure is building to get a deal done by March 2019, as you've already heard. For the United States, there are important trade, national security, and foreign policy implications for the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. The promises by the Leave camp are likely to be broken with agreements to the European Court of Justice, and the cost of leaving likely difficult pills to swallow. While the U.S.-UK relationship is likely to change following their exit from the EU, the bond between our two nations will endure. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today about Brexit and the best way for Congress to plan for the future. I yield back.
Yes, well, thank you. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge a few dignitaries. We have some elected officials from the Republic of Ireland who are here this week in Washington for meetings and specifically this hearing. So Senator Billy Lawless, Deputy Dara O'Brien, and Deputy Sean Barrett, you are welcome here at any time in the halls of Congress. As perhaps the chairman and ranking member may know, and certainly Chairman Royce will remember, in 2016, about a month or two before the Brexit vote in June of 2016, I went to Chairman Royce and ranking member Engel and I said, I would really like for us in the Foreign Affairs Committee to hold a hearing on Brexit. And I think I've been pestering them every month or so since then, because at the time I thought there was a much higher possibility of a vote for Brexit than was commonly thought in the mainstream media, either in the UK or the US. And sure enough, by 52-48, Brexit ended up happening, one of a couple very interesting and surprising election results in that year. One of the reasons why I was so concerned about Brexit was the impact, obviously, on the US-UK relationship, a very important relationship. Losing the UK as a voice at the wider EU table, which I believe would hurt US influence, but also and especially the unintended consequence it would have on the peace process in Northern Ireland. One of the great achievements of American, Irish, and British foreign policy, one of the few achievements in foreign policy peace processes in my lifetime, has been the Northern Ireland peace process. And both Democrats and Republicans in Capitol Hill can be proud of that because we played a leading role in pushing our own US administration at the presidential level to get diplomatically involved. It was at the urging of Republican Congressman Pete King and Democratic Congressman Richie Neal and Joe Crowley and a number of others who have retired that President Clinton gave a visa to Jerry Adams, brought Sinn Féin into a political process. At first it was controversial, but the British eventually saw the wisdom in that. We ended up having a ceasefire, and sure enough, especially through the good work of George Mitchell and the support of Dublin and London, we're able to reach the Good Friday Agreement. But now, because of Brexit, what for 20 years has been a seamless border, I have crossed it by accident. You can literally be driving along the road and not realize that you have crossed the border, in fact, a couple times. Now that is suddenly all at risk. And as you may have noticed just recently as this week, you saw the apparently British Prime Minister Theresa May had reached an agreement only an hour later to reverse that and here where we are. So when I ask my questions, I'm going to focus Specifically on the border issue, there are a number of very important aspects of Brexit, specifically for the United States. And so I again really commend the leadership of this subcommittee for holding this hearing, and I thank you.
Well, thank you and welcome aboard. And a new welcome aboard, of course, goes John Curtis. Do you have an opening statement for us today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I do, and would like to mention, due to other commitments, I won't be able to answer my questions in person, but would like to submit those and look forward to hearing from you. However, I would want to make sure that I express my appreciation for me and my constituents in Utah for the great relationship that we have with the United Kingdom, for the many years of history of that relationship, for the mutually beneficial things that flow from that relationship, and look forward to maintaining that. In addition, hoping that as this Brexit moves forward, it can be done as gracefully as possible so that we can enjoy that same relationship with others in the European Union. And thank you for being here today.
I will now introduce our panelists, and again, thank you to each and every one of you today. And as I say, if you could put it down to about 5 minutes, then we can all have a nice dialogue about the points that you've made. So first, and what I'll do is I'll introduce all of you, and then we'll go one by one. First, we have Niall Gardner, and is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. And don't let anybody ever suggest, because I love the Irish, as my boss Ronald Reagan did, that we didn't also love Margaret Thatcher. So, but on the record there. Dr. Gardner is an expert on USA-UK relationships and previously served as an aide to Lady Thatcher from 2000 to 2002. He earned a doctorate in history from Yale and holds degrees from Oxford University as well. And Marjorie Chorlins, all right, as Vice President for European Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Executive Director of the U.S.-UK Business Council. She has worked in both the private and public sectors with increasing seniority. She served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary within the Commerce Department and held senior positions with Motorola as well. She is a graduate of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and Wesley College. Finally, we have with us Thomas Wright. He is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institute. Previously, he was executive director at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, a lecturer at the University of Chicago, and a senior researcher for the Princeton Project on National Security. He has earned a doctorate from Georgetown University and other degrees from Cambridge University and the University in Dublin. Your full written statements will be made part of the record, and so, Mr. Gardner, you may proceed.
Yeah, thank you. Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committee. For reasons of time, I will be summarizing parts of my written statement. Today's hearing takes place at a crucially important moment for the United Kingdom, America's closest friend and ally. On June 23, 2016, 17.4 million Britons voted to leave the European Union in a historic referendum, with nearly 52% of the vote. Turnout was over 72% of the electorate. A majority of the British people voted to retake control of Britain's borders, laws, trade, and destiny, with an emphatic declaration of national sovereignty and self-determination. On March 29, 2019, Great Britain will leave the European Union, and for the first time in nearly half a century, it will be free to negotiate its own free trade deals and fully shape its own path. Brexit offers the British people an opportunity to forge a new future as a truly global, outward-looking, innovative and prosperous world power, a standard bearer of economic freedom and liberty. Despite the dire warnings presented by opponents of Brexit in what was dubbed Project Fear, Britain has thrived since the Brexit referendum, with growing inward investment into the UK, falling unemployment, and a soaring stock market. The British government is presently negotiating a post-Brexit arrangement with the 27 other members of the European Union who are represented by the European Commission. The talks, which began in June this year, have already gone through several rounds, with the 7th due to take place later this month. The negotiations are highly complex and have at times been tense, especially over the EU's financial demands, which have been rightly criticised in the UK in some quarters as excessive and even extortionate. The European Commission's extremely aggressive approach is driven by several factors, including a desire to extract as much money as possible from the British people before they are freed from the shackles of the EU, combined with a deep-seated hostility towards Brexit among EU officials who see it as a direct challenge to the European project. The European Commission has taken the wrong lessons from Britain's EU exit. Brexit sent a clear message that Europe needs greater sovereignty, decentralization of power, and increased political accountability. This should be a moment for humility rather than arrogance from European Union officials. Yet the response of European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has been to double down and call for even greater powers for Brussels. His recent State of the Union address before the European Parliament was a delusional rallying cry for a federal Europe at a time when voters across Europe are increasingly opting for a very different vision. The EU's unelected and unaccountable ruling elites fear that Britain's exit will encourage other countries in the EU to go down the same path as the UK. They believe that the terms of Britain's exit must be severe and harsh in order to act as a deterrent and as a warning to others that there are major risks and consequences for going down the same path. The European Commission's demand for a vast Brexit bill before trade talks can even begin are, in my view, mean-spirited, unrealistic, and insulting. Additionally, they are a potentially insurmountable stumbling block to any agreement being reached between London and Brussels. If the EU continues to insist on making demands that are onerous and unacceptable, the United Kingdom should be prepared to walk away from talks with Brussels and pursue a no-deal option, whereby Great Britain trades with the European Union under World Trade Organization rules. This would be a far better course than accepting terms which are unpalatable to the British people. Britain is a global economic power that now conducts more business with the rest of the world than it does with the EU. While a genuine free trade deal with the EU would be ideal, Britain can thrive and prosper if necessary without one. Britain is a huge export market for European producers, and goods and services will continue to flow between the UK and EU regardless of whether a formal agreement is in place. To be a truly sovereign nation, Britain must be outside of the EU single market, customs union, and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. These should be clear red lines for the Brexit negotiations. The United States has a major strategic interest in the long-term success of Brexit, as well as in an enduring transatlantic alliance, which has remained the foundation of post-war US global leadership. An independent Britain will be a stronger ally for America than one submerged within an increasingly federal Europe. Britain in the Brexit era is a powerful force on the world stage, playing a leading role in bolstering NATO's eastern flank in the Baltic states, acting as the second biggest contributor to US-led operations against ISIS, and preparing to launch 2 world-class aircraft carriers. Far from retreating into isolationism, Brexit Britain is emerging as a growing force to be reckoned with across the globe. Brexit will only strengthen the transatlantic alliance rather than weaken it, leading to a more self-confident Britain that is better able to stand with the United States. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify for you today. In conclusion, Britain's decision to leave the EU should be a cause for celebration here in America. And as Britain's Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson noted in his speech to the Conservative Party conference in Manchester recently, it is time to let the British lion roar again on the world stage, a formidable force for freedom alongside the American eagle. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're on here. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Ranking Member, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today on the economic impact of Brexit and how we can strengthen the economic relationship between the U.S. and the UK. The Chamber established the US-UK Business Council to provide a platform for American businesses to be heard as the UK resets its relationship with the EU. Our members are eager to deepen our bilateral relationship after Brexit takes place, up to and including negotiation of a free trade agreement when the time is right. The Council has provided inputs to Brussels and London on several issues, including the future of UK-EU economic relations, the urgent need for an early agreement on a transition period, and the dangers of a no-deal Brexit. Today's hearing is another useful opportunity to ensure American investors' voices are heard. The long-standing special relationship between the U.S. and UK is built on deep and abiding economic and security ties. The durability of this alliance derives from our shared commitment to rule of law, democratic norms, and free enterprise. American companies have long looked to the UK as a safe and certain market. Even though the U.S. has no direct role in the negotiations between the UK and EU, we have a responsibility to advocate for a minimally disruptive outcome. If Brexit is mismanaged, or if the UK crashes out of the EU without an agreement, the economic consequences would be substantial. As has been noted, to date, progress in these complicated divorce proceedings has been limited, especially on the three primary issues of citizens' rights, border in Ireland, and the UK's financial obligations. European leaders do acknowledge that some progress is made, but as of today, they believe momentum is not yet sufficient to move to discussion of the future relationship. Our hope is that they will finally agree to move forward with that broader discussion at the European Council meeting later this month. Still, that leaves less than a year to negotiate and ratify the final terms of the UK's exit and to outline the terms of their future relationship. The clock is ticking, as this one, and time is running short. Bilateral economic ties between the U.S. and UK are significant. We're each other's single largest foreign investors, and more than 2.5 million jobs depend directly on those investments. U.S. companies have invested approximately $600 billion in the UK, which represents nearly a quarter of U.S. investment in Europe and approximately 12% of all U.S. foreign investment worldwide. British companies have invested more than $480 billion here. 1.1 million Americans work for these companies. Every American state has jobs that are connected to or originated from an investment by a UK company. These are high-quality and high-paying jobs. The UK is our fourth largest export destination. U.S. goods and services exports to the UK exceeded $120 billion in 2016, yielding a $15 billion trade surplus. Over 42,000 American firms directly export to the UK, and more than 7,500 American companies have operations there. Given the depth of our existing relationship, the Brexit negotiations and follow-on UK-EU talks matter deeply for American business. It's important to underline that much of U.S. investment in the UK was made with an eye toward accessing the much larger EU single market. A future UK-EU trade agreement will almost certainly not replicate the economic advantages of Britain's current membership in the single market. For example, financial services firms are likely to lose their passporting rights to operate in all EU jurisdictions from their UK headquarters. Changes in the regulatory space also are anticipated. Divergences between the UK and EU rules will make compliance more difficult and expensive for US companies with interests across Europe. Digital privacy compliance mechanisms could also be in legal jeopardy if the EU and UK do not negotiate an agreement on data flows. This will affect every American company that does business on either side of the English Channel. A no-deal Brexit with no negotiated outcome governing the future terms of the trade regulation or the movement of labor would be a disaster for U.S. companies. The consequences will be immediate and severe. For trade, implementing the so-called WTO option would likely lead to sizable losses in two-way trade and investment. The WTO has not liberalized international trade and services to nearly the same degree as the EU. Services represent an outsized share of U.S. companies' investment in and exports from Britain, so a lack of regulatory certainty would be particularly damaging. How many jobs will leave Britain and where they may end up is among the most difficult changes to predict. Many companies are understandably waiting for further clarity before greenlighting any new investments in the UK. American investors have developed worst-case contingency plans, which they may be forced to execute if clarity isn't forthcoming quickly. Even as the Brexit negotiations play out, the UK is and will remain a vital economic partner for the United States. The UK has a talented English-speaking and tech-savvy workforce. Its government has traditionally preferred a regulatory model that rewards innovation and encourages competition, much like the American model. The UK has been a consistent advocate for the digital economy, ensuring regulatory decisions are fact-based and rely on sound science, and has supported a predictable and transparent business climate. While we will miss that voice in Brussels, the UK's departure creates opportunities for the US to strengthen our bilateral ties, up to and including a possible free trade agreement when the time is right. Any commercially meaningful US-UK agreement should focus heavily on the services sector and also on setting global standards in important areas such as digital trade, regulatory cooperation, investment protection, promoting trade opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises, competition, and treatment of state-owned enterprises. While traditional market access barriers are low between the US and UK, removing all tariffs would still yield significant benefits. This is especially true for small companies, for which a 5% tariff or an extra customs form may be the difference between a profitable sale and a missed opportunity. In closing, even as we pursue closer US-UK ties, strengthening our ties with the rest of Europe also must remain a priority. The US has promoted a more integrated European market for the past 7 decades. This has proven tremendously successful for the Transatlantic Alliance and for American companies that do business in Europe. With that in mind, we must ultimately endeavor to deepen trade and investment ties with both Britain and the EU in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and Dr. Wright.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, and distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in front of this committee. We are gathered here at a crucial moment in the history of post-war Europe. The UK's decision to exit the EU, I think, is the most significant and important decision it has taken since the end of the Cold War. It raises fundamental questions about Europe's future, and the United States has a vital interest in how these questions are resolved. In my written testimony, I provide my analysis of where the negotiations stand and where I think they are likely to end up. I believe there will eventually be a deal largely along the lines laid out by the EU side, and I'm happy to elaborate that in the questions. But I would like to use the time allotted to me to speak now about American interests and US policy in the Brexit process. In my view, if Brexit is going to occur, the United States has a vital interest in a Brexit that produces as strong and as prosperous a UK as possible, and as strong and as prosperous an EU as possible, working closely with each other and with America. This should be the organizing principle of US policy towards Brexit. We should actively consider any steps that can facilitate this outcome, and we should oppose any steps that undermine it. With that in mind, I am concerned by the current policy pursued by the Trump administration. The Trump administration has supported Brexit rhetorically, but in practice it has done the UK few favours. Just 2 quick examples. In a major speech on US-UK relations in November, the US Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross made it clear that if the UK wanted a free trade agreement with the US would have to choose between the United States and the EU. The UK would have to choose US regulatory standards and diverge from those of the EU. Secretary Ross's logic is clear. The UK is in a weak position and needs trade deals with third parties so the United States can afford to take a maximalist position in negotiations. Second example, at the World Trade Organization in October, the Trump administration sided with Brazil and other countries to oppose a deal already reached between the UK and the EU to divide agricultural import quotas between them, greatly complicating Britain's diplomacy. More generally, the Trump administration has pursued a very passive approach to the negotiations. It sees it purely as an internal issue and has not identified any US equities, including maintaining the Good Friday Agreement, preserving security cooperation between the UK and the EU 27, or ensuring there was a negotiated settlement between the parties. On the contrary, it has given the impression that the UK and the EU's problems may present the United States with immediate opportunities. I am in favour of closer economic ties between the US and the UK, but at this time I do not believe that Washington and London should pursue a bilateral FTA along the lines of that proposed by Secretary Ross and the Trump administration. There are very few tariffs between the US and UK, so any FTA would have to focus primarily on regulatory standards. The Trump administration's current policy is to use all of the leverage at its disposal, including the threat of tariffs, to compel the UK to diverge from the EU regulations and adopt ours. That, I think, has 2 problems. The first is that the negotiations are unlikely to succeed on these terms and will alienate much of the UK population. I can expand more on that later. The second, and I think even more critical problem, is that in the unlikely event that they do succeed on the terms set by Secretary Ross, they will by definition reduce the UK's trade access to the EU. The more the UK diverges from EU regulatory standards, the less access they will have to the single market. The net effect of this will be to damage the economy of the UK and the EU, which would also damage US economic and strategic interests. It should be noted that closer economic ties between the UK and the EU is, as close as possible, is the official position of the UK government, which is seeking a comprehensive trade deal. They should be free to do so without being pressured by the United States. More generally, the US should make it clear to the UK and the EU that it favours the negotiated agreement. We can live with almost any deal acceptable to both parties, but a Brexit without a deal would not be in our interests. The United States, finally, as I'm running out of time, I would like to say a word about Northern Ireland. We are approaching the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, an agreement, as members have noted, that many Americans on both sides of the aisle have helped to bring about and sustain. It is absolutely necessary for the United States to remain engaged on preserving the peace in Northern Ireland. I elaborate on this in my written testimony, but suffice to say here that this peace, I think, is threatened by the current state of the negotiations. If there is not a special consideration for Northern Ireland to ensure that there's an open border, I think it does put the Good Friday Agreement at risk. As a first step, the Trump administration should immediately reinstate the position of Special Envoy for Northern Ireland, which I understand was abolished by Secretary Tillerson along with other envoys, and prioritise and preserving the Good Friday Agreement should also be an issue in relations with the UK and the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for your testimony. And let's just, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure my colleagues, you know what I'm going to do? I know that you have a special place in your heart for Ireland, just from what you've said. So I'm going to give you a chance to talk about the Irish part of this right now before we ask the rest of our questions. You can be the lead-off guy.
Thank you, very, very gracious, and thank the indulgence of my colleagues. Dr. Wright, I wanted to follow up, and actually this is a perfect segue because you just concluded on this. I noticed in your written testimony, you mentioned a recent study by the UK government and the EU Commission, which identified, and this was frankly a higher number than even I expected, the UK government EU Commission report identified 142 areas of cross-border activities, from healthcare to agriculture, which I was familiar with, that 142 areas, all of which would be detrimentally impacted by Brexit. Could you expand on the findings of the report, specifically as it relates to the border communities, whether they're, regardless of which side of the border they currently sit on?
Yes, the study showed that the cross-border cooperation that was provided for under the Good Friday Agreement really rests on regulatory alignment between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So the fact that they have the same regulations on agriculture, on health, on these wide array of issues means that they're able to cooperate on these issues. And in the aggregate, this really, I think, has had a very progressive impact in terms of the peace process. It's built trust across the two communities and across the border. If there is significant divergence in regulations, all of those areas of cooperation, my understanding is, either come to an end or are significantly reduced. And so the Irish government and the EU27 and the British government, I think, are concerned by the broader impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland separately than the border issue, which of course is also a very severe issue with major implications.
I'll just share one specific anecdote that I just heard the other day that crystallizes part of what you're talking about. The Irish government funds a world-class cancer research center, and in order to reach the northern counties, it decided to situate it in Derry, even though Derry is in fact not part of the Republic of Ireland, but just geographically, in order to reach that part of the Republic of Ireland and the counties in Northern Ireland that are part of the UK, decided that that would geographically be the smartest place to put it, as that's a big population center. Now they're concerned what happens if you have different regulations regulating health and the research that goes into cancer, what that will do for pharmaceuticals. Essentially creates a massive headache. With the breakdown of talks on Monday, where one moment Financial Times is reporting breakthrough deal and the BBC reporting the same thing, and then about an hour later, not so fast. This week has obviously been tumultuous, probably the most tumultuous on the border issue. Again, Dr. Wright, if you could discuss the various political issues at play. I've had a number of colleagues come up to me asking me, so what exactly is this about? And if you could elaborate on the issues that have prevented an agreed upon solution to prevent a hard border, even though it seems to be something that Washington, London, Dublin, nationalists and unionists all agree on, and yet in practice difficult to achieve.
Yes, thank you. The British government after Brexit made it clear that Brexit meant leaving the single market and the customs union. So it would leave the market that allowed for free movement of goods, capital, services and people, and the common tariff area. It is widely believed that if Britain leaves the customs union and the single market, that there will have to be a customs border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that without it there will be danger of smuggling, there will be all sorts of problems that would arise. And so in order to prevent a hard border from happening, either the UK has to remain inside the single market and customs union as a whole, or there needs to be what the diplomats, I understand, calls regulatory alignment, whereby Northern Ireland chooses to maintain the regulations of the single market and customs union, so there would be no gap with the Republic of Ireland and there could be an open border. And that position is unacceptable to the Democratic Unionist Party, which is providing support through a confidence and supply agreement for Theresa May's government. And so they are unable to get that through without their support. And as a result, we're at a deadlock because the EU 27, including the Irish government, is very strongly of the view there shouldn't be a hard border. The DUP is opposed to the proposed solution. The British government also says it doesn't want a hard border, but it finds itself unable, I think, to support the solution that was identified.
Finally, I just want to ask about the special envoy. So not specifically related to Brexit, but obviously this is an area where a special envoy could help. Could you speak a bit about the importance of the U.S. maintaining a special envoy, something that was supported by the Bush administration, obviously created under the Clinton administration? That was the formal official role that George Mitchell had, something that has happened for the previous 20 years. And also if you could address perhaps a perception by some in Washington who maybe aren't intimately involved in this issue, who just assume, oh, that's all well and good, right? Didn't they achieve peace and everyone lives happily ever after? And maybe doesn't quite recognize that unfortunately reality is not necessarily as rosy as that picture.
Yes, very briefly, the U.S. has had a crucial role in the Northern Ireland peace process from the very beginning, and I think has been critical to its success. Secretary Tillerson abolished this position along with other special envoys. I think it made sense if this hadn't been happening, because even though there are problems with the governance in Belfast, but with Brexit, I think it is particularly important to have U.S. engagement. I would just raise one other issue as well that I didn't have in my written testimony, but I think there's also a role for a non-governmental involvement by the former diplomats and political leaders who have been involved in Northern Ireland. For instance, the Irish government and the EU, the UK could agree to set up an international commission led by an American that would try to identify solutions to Brexit that uphold the Good Friday Agreement. They may be seen as more independently minded than the Irish government is by the unionist community. So I think there are imaginative ways that we could proceed here, but simply having no engagement whatsoever and treating it purely as an internal issue with no role for the United States, I think is regrettable.
Yes, because obviously, as we saw throughout the 70s and 80s, the British government is not going to be perceived as a neutral arbiter by the nationalist community, and the Irish government in Dublin is not going to be perceived as a neutral arbiter by the unionist community, hence the positive role that the U.S. can play, having a strong relationship with all sides. Thank you very much.
And yes, we are friends with both our British friends and our Irish friends, which makes us the perfect in-between. Let me just note there will always be a logical explanation of why we need to give all of our rights to make our own decisions away to some central government, maybe even some global government. And that led to some real problems even at the level that Great Britain had given up certain rights, as Mr. Gardner mentioned. The centralization and the bureaucracy that it spawned was not necessarily, or at least the British people obviously did not think it was in their interests. Maybe you can tell us, Mr. Gardner, what your analysis of where the British people are at in all of this. Obviously, they voted by a very recognizable majority that they wanted to separate from Brussels. What was their reason? And but tell us going from there.
Well, thank you very much for that question, and a very important question. I think the reasons for Brexit are multiple. Primarily, the British people voted to leave the European Union in order to re-establish their own full sovereignty as a sovereign nation state, to take back control of British laws, Britain's borders, Britain's destiny as a free country. And I think the issue of self-determination was absolutely the heart of Brexit. It was also, I think, a desire on the part of the British people to be able to really take full control of their own borders, decide who comes into the country. At the moment, Britain does not have that full control in terms of people coming in from the European Union. But this was also, I think, a rejection of the European Union ruling elites, seen as increasingly unaccountable, aloof, undemocratic. It's not just in Britain, I think, that you have this momentum. You see it all over Europe, in many European countries. And the reality is that the European project today is viewed by, I would say, the majority of the British people as outdated. It hasn't moved with the times. It's seen as a hugely centralized entity, a supranational entity that tramples upon the rights of individual nation states. And so national sovereignty is fundamentally important to the British people. And I believe that the US government actually fully understands that. And I think the support given by the present US administration for the British government over Brexit has been very much welcomed by the British side. And it is good that the White House supports Brexit and views Brexit as a powerful force that will strengthen the special relationship, actually, which indeed it will do. But at the end of the day, Brexit was all about the desire on the part of the British people to once again be a truly free, sovereign people. Those are universal, extremely powerful principles.
And, excuse me, is this same spirit not identified in several other areas in Europe, where we have in Spain, you have people who want to have their own government, and you have various peoples now throughout the world, actually, that are suggesting that the right of self-determination is not something that just no longer exists in the souls of human beings in this modern age. Let me just note that I believe that that same type of desire for a group of people to control their own destiny and not to be controlled by even a group of nations or a group of other people is just, it's part of what America was all about in the beginning, and that spirit is still around in different parts of the world today. And the more you have centralization, I know that that's a different way of looking at government. The more centralized your government and distant it is, the more likely that those people holding power will be arrogant and less responsive than if you have someone in your local community or your state or even in your own country handling those same type of governmental decision-making. And could you, it's Clarence, okay. Could you please let us know what the trade is like between the United States and the EU versus the United States and just Great Britain?
Certainly. The UK, as I mentioned, is the U.S.'s fourth largest
Right.
export destination and our seventh largest trading partner overall. The EU is our single largest trading partner if you look at it as a unified market.
Does that include Great Britain?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so how much, I'm trying to see how much of that trade thing is Great Britain and the two entities as compared to one another?
I don't have specific facts at my disposal, but I'm happy to provide that in my written answers to
I'd like
the
to,
subcommittee.
please do, because when we're trying to figure out the economic, impact of this, exactly whether or not the EU is in itself, absent of Great Britain, dominates, or whether Great Britain is actually a major force in this, we need to know. Dr. Gardner already has mentioned that the stock market in Great Britain is soaring. Is that correct?
Well, it has soared since the Brexit referendum, and I'd say that Britain is doing extremely well in the Brexit era, including in terms of foreign direct investment, which has risen significantly over the past year. And tens of thousands of new jobs have been created in the UK since the Brexit referendum. It's significant that Google actually is building a brand new European headquarters in London at the cost of £1 billion, employing 7,000 people. It's a sign of US confidence in Great Britain. And the United States has invested in the UK about $5 trillion worth of corporate assets. That's 22% of America's total overseas corporate assets invested.
I find that predictions of gloom and doom, when someone is trying to make political determinations, usually are absolutely wrong. I mean, just totally wrong. I mean, we had, don't want to rub it in too much, but the fact is that we were going to face a major economic crisis and the stock market was going to go through the bottom if our current president was elected, and we've seen just the opposite. And so when we're trying to determine what economic viability is, we should actually look at the figures and figure out what is, and let me ask Dr. Wright, so what do you predict in terms of economically this a separate entity with Great Britain? Is this going to be a positive economic force for both Britain, maybe even Europe, or is this going to be a negative force?
I think it's net negative for both the UK and the EU. Brexit, I think, will damage the UK in several respects. The first is that the proposal by the British government is to engage on this global economic diplomacy to secure trade deals with all sorts of countries, including the US. They are doing so at a time when protectionist sentiment is at post-Cold War high. So it's extremely difficult to negotiate trade deals in that environment. The City of London, which is probably Britain's most important services economy, I think will lose much of its ability to do business for the EU because of the lack of what's called passporting rights that it enjoys under the single market.
So you're predicting there
will, I think, be something of a decline. The other point, I don't know how large it will be, but I think it will damage the British economy overall. And the final point is that it's often said that Britain can deregulate if it leads the single market and reduces number of regulations. The opposite is also possible. If Jeremy Corbyn were to be elected Prime Minister, he would be free to massively increase US regulation beyond that which is imposed by the EU at the moment. So you could easily see the arrow go in the other direction as well. So I think it is quite risky. That being said, they have decided to leave, which is why I've argued for as close an economic relationship between the UK and the EU and between the US and the UK and the EU. So I think it's important to make sure that this works if this is what they want to do. But I don't think we should believe that there's enormous economic opportunities out there that have not been availed of to date.
Okay, Dr. Gardner, you're pretty optimistic as compared to pessimistic.
Yes, actually, I mean, just in response to Dr. Wright's comments, I would say that there's no evidence whatsoever of any flight of capital out of the City of London since the Brexit referendum. In fact, quite the opposite is happening. And as we saw when Britain decided not to be part of the European single currency, the City of London, the world's biggest financial centre, thrived and prospered outside of the single currency. And I think we're going to see the same thing with Britain outside of the European Union, freed of the immense regulatory burdens that exist within the EU. And so there's not a shred of evidence to suggest that Britain's economy or the City of London will suffer as a result of being outside of the European Union. Not one US investment bank, for example, has decided to close its offices in London and relocate elsewhere in Europe. So American confidence and global confidence in the UK is extremely high, and already Britain is beginning to enter into trade discussions, negotiations with over 70 countries across the world. And so there is every reason to believe there will be a highly successful US-UK free trade deal and trade agreements between the United Kingdom, the world's fifth largest economy, and nations across the globe.
Well, thank you, and we'll wait and see what happens, and then we'll, one of you guys are going to have to buy the round of drinks for whoever was right on this one.
Ms. Chorlins is trying to...
Mr. Chairman, I would just note that while it is the case that jobs may not yet have moved from American companies who are present in the UK, it is very much the case that American companies have significant contingency plans in place, and some of them have in fact announced their decision to move some part of their employee base from the UK to the continent because of this uncertainty about the relationship in the future. That's just the practical reality.
So, and we'll wait and see if Britain has a market that will attract more companies back when it's making its own decisions as compared to whether it's making its economic decisions with all those other countries being involved in setting the policy that Great Britain will have, just like everybody else. So with that said, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was going to ask that very same question because I know in talking to some of our, coming from New York, my financial services community where we've got, huge trade in financial service and in services, that they are talking about contingency plans now as to where they move. Some, of course, coming back to New York and staying there, but others, they're looking at some other European cities because they also want that connection with the EU because they are, as you said, collectively, part of our largest trading bloc collectively, and they're trying to figure out how they will continue with both because they're significant for both the EU and the UK. I'm just, one of my concerns, of course, is I think that the unity of the EU and setting rules collectively together, working together, and then we've been looking at standards with the United States. It helps us with global trade and economies all over the place. The lack of that is why I started out in my statement of lose, lose, lose. I see there's opportunities for each and every one of us to lose in that regards. If we don't figure out how to make sure that we're working and doing this thing collectively, which is why, and I'll start with you, Dr. Wright. I didn't, trying to figure out why then would Prime Minister May commit to bringing the UK outside of the custom union and single market, thereby having a hard Brexit early in the negotiations. Since certainly it would make sense for Britain to remain within the customs union, I think, similarly like Turkey has, considering how much trade the UK and the EU does. So, I mean, can you give me any fathom of reasons why or difficulties that are?
Yes, absolutely. I think that it's a terrific question, and I think the short answer is that to remain part of the single market, which would allow them to essentially continue to trade in the financial services sector and all of its other services industries, would have meant accepting the free movement of peoples, because there are 4 freedoms to the single market: goods, services, capital, and people. And the EU has said that those are indivisible. You cannot cherry pick and say we're going to take 3 of the 4. The UK, I think, would like to cherry pick and would like to take some of those and keep their access on those but reject the others. And the EU has rejected that because the integrity of the single market is of vital importance to them. And as a result, Theresa May's government has said it's leaving the single markets and customs union. I would be interested in Niall's view on that too. I'm not sure we probably disagree much on the diagnosis of why that's the case, but I think that's the nub of the disagreement.
Right.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and also I think Dr. Wright has made some very good points there. It would be really impossible for the United Kingdom to remain inside the customs union and the single market if it is to become a truly sovereign nation. If Britain remains inside the customs union, it would not be able to negotiate its own free trade agreements. And this is a big part of Brexit. The idea of Britain being a truly global actor, free to negotiate its own free trade deals all over the world, including with the United States. As a member of the customs union, Britain would not be able to do that. And as a member of the single market, Britain, as Dr. Wright mentioned, would not be able to control its borders, would have no say really over who comes in from the rest of Europe. And so fundamentally important issues. And so the British people voted to retake control and reassert some sovereignty. And so remaining in the single market and the customs union would be impossible in order to honor those commitments.
So it sounds to me that you're talking about part of the issue of Brexit has also to do with migration and the problems that was taking place on the European continent, as opposed to talking about, as Ms. Chorlins is talking about, the integration of markets where we can do trade and collectively there's the free flow of business going across these borders. Is that not correct?
I think certainly that the issue of border control immigration was an important factor in the Brexit referendum, a major issue. But I do believe that Britain is in a position to negotiate a strong free trade agreement with the European Union. Britain should continue to be able to have that access to European markets. It's in the interest of the United Kingdom and the EU to reach an agreement that is good for both sides. After all, a huge amount of exports from the EU go into the UK. You look, for example, at the German car market, about 1 in every 4 or 5 German cars goes to Britain. So it's in Germany's interest to strike a good deal. And I think that a free trade agreement between both sides actually would be in the interest of both Britain and the European Union.
Except I've found that sometimes initially it was thought that the EU would just accept whatever the UK said, and the UK would be able to dominate that discussion, and the UK. And I think it's finding out now that the EU is not just going to give them whatever they want. That is not what the realities are starting to show. And as a result, there's going to be a give and take. And I know in talking to some of our companies in the United States, as a result, because one of the things that business does not like, and I'll ask Mrs. Collins, that is uncertainty. Where you don't know, because they have to plan for 5 and 10 and 15 years down the road. They can't move, just or live with an uncertainty. So I think that's going to affect overall how we determine and where we negotiate free trade agreements. In fact, Ms. Chorlins, you said that we will want to do something with the UK when the time is right. That was an important piece, when the time is right. When would that be? I mean, I understand from the agreement with with Brexit is that you can't negotiate anything until at least after 2 years after the deal is done. So how far down the road is it, and how does that affect the thinking of our American companies as to how they're going to do business or where they're going to do business, whether it's in the EU or the UK or any place else, and try to do a deal?
I think you touch on a very important point about the need for certainty, and that's why the business community has been as active in pursuing or following these negotiations. As far as when the US and UK could actually negotiate a trade agreement between themselves, that's driven largely by when the EU and UK complete their negotiations. Until we know what the UK's relationship will look like with the EU, it will be impossible really for us to know what the right terms should be for a UK-US negotiation. So the timing really is largely driven by the pace at which the UK and EU negotiate their own future trade arrangement. But you're absolutely right. Certainty is something that the business community is eagerly looking for in this process, and we've gone out of our way to make it clear to both the UK and the EU governments that uncertainty about the way forward is going to have a detrimental economic effect.
And then, you know, because it becomes important, you know, to me still, once Brexit is done, that the EU and the UK still have relationships. But my question is, how will the UK be able to maintain a friction-free trade with the EU's internal market after leaving it, because it rules out the European Court of Justice jurisdiction and continued regulatory alignments? So how's that going to work?
Mr. Ranking Member, I think you've put your finger on what is the, I don't know how many billion euro question. But the real issue is indeed, how do you structure a relationship that minimizes the friction when you have to thrash out issues such as the Irish border, where we do risk serious delays if a border is reimposed, and there's real economic cost associated with that. I think that we have yet to see from either the UK or the EU clear indications of what their thinking is about the future relationship between those two. Clearly, both sides want to sustain a strong relationship. They need each other. But how that works in practical terms is very much an open question, and one that both sides are working through in very real time.
Mr. Wright, you want to add anything? Dr. Wright, excuse me.
Yes. There is no way, I think, for the UK to have as much access as it currently does if it leaves the single market and the customs union. It's just impossible. Any deal that they do will be significantly less in terms of access. A deal will not be agreed by March 2019. By March 2019, they propose only to have a broad political statement about what the deal would look like. It will then take many years for the trade deal to be negotiated. It has to be ratified by every single country in the EU, including several by referendum. So during that period of time, there will be a transition deal under which it almost looks certain that Britain will have to abide by all of the rules of the single market and customs union without any influence or votes. And so there is a problem about how that deal would be structured. I think that I very much agree with you. I think that is why remaining in the customs union and the single market would be a better choice for the UK, but this government has decided not to do that. Interestingly, it was not necessarily a key part of the referendum campaign. Some people said that, some people did not, and so there wasn't a unified position on it in advance. But I think therein lies the risk for the US economy, because the US really needs a strong UK and a strong EU. It was mentioned a number of times in this, but the US actually does benefit from the EU. If there is a Eurozone crisis or a breakup of the Eurozone, that will cause a global financial crisis. The EU is a vital partner of the US in economic security, like sanctions, that isn't a part of NATO or any other military organization. You know, so it has all of these benefits for the US. So I think moving the lose-lose-lose to a win-win, I think, is the major challenge.
And the way we do things today, when you're talking about trade, I think Ms. Chorlin's talked about it, the data flows, which is important, and how that's worked, and supply chain. You know, as we're talking about trade now, supply chain is important. This is the way it develops. We're no longer, you know, the economy and trade the way we did it in the 19th and 20th century. This is the 21st century. Globalization is here. Things go as faster than its speed than ever imagined before. And there's interconnectedness that depends upon our strength. And if there's a part of the chain that is weak, then it can hurt and be devastating to everybody, as we saw that took place when we had the financial crisis in the United States in 2008. It affected everybody and not just the United States. And that's why this is so important to all of us, whether you come from, whether you're part of the EU or now part of the UK and of course of the United States, and why I feel that we've got to make sure that there is, and we turn this thing around so there can be a win-win-win, because if we don't, we all will be victimized and lose from it. And I yield back to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Meeks. I think we've had a very worthwhile discussion. I'm going to wait and see which one of you two guys in particular. She was right there in the middle with all the facts, but you guys had your have opinions on this isn't going to succeed or this is, so we'll watch and see. Let me just note that I'm really proud that the United States led the way on this whole idea of self-determination. I think that our Declaration of Independence, it says it all. You know, government only derives its powers from the consent of the governed, and that people have a right and must declare their right to control their own destiny, and we declared that in our Declaration of Independence. That spirit, I think, is alive today, and not just in Great Britain, but in other areas of the world where people are no longer accepting the domination of other groups of people. And I think that when you have a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies are always arrogant, even if they're local bureaucracies, but they become ever more arrogant and ineffective as far away from those people who they're regulating as they go. The farther away they go, the more arrogant it is. And I think the people I know in Great Britain who talked about Brussels had a deep-seated, just antagonistic relationship with that Brussels. People over there who they don't know who they are and maybe don't even like people in Britain are making decisions for them, economic decisions that affected their lives. I think that whole spirit, I know there are a lot of people who think the spirit of nationalism is a negative force in this world. I think that the greatest sins that have been committed against the people on this planet, the human race, have been done so by some not nationalistic enterprise, but instead by some global vision of, whether it's a radical Islamic global world or whether it's some sort of communist world, some ideal that they were going to superimpose, and that all the different things would then disappear because you'd have a centralized government or based on benevolence, and the benevolence of those people would just come out naturally. I don't think so. I don't think that's what government, I don't think that's what happens. I don't think that's what actually history will record. As the bigger the government gets and the further away, and the more it's going to control our lives for the benefit of all, the more people get stepped on and the less progress there is. This is especially true, I believe, in this modern age. And the fact is today, smaller entities of government, whether it's Great Britain as compared to all of Europe, or whether it's Singapore, or whether it's whatever entities are there, you can do now, you can have global communications and global transfers of wealth in one form or another in order to do business. And that didn't happen in the years before. Maybe you needed a bigger government at that time, but now you can have small entities that are communicating with big entities all over the world. I'll be waiting to see whether or not, once this thing is, all these things are settled, whether or not more people will be trying to invest in Europe, or whether more people will go to Great Britain that is now separated from the EU. That'll be a very important historic occasion, and it's ours to see what happens with this. So thank you for leading our discussion today. Thank you, Gregory, for your major. He always contributes. He's always right to the matter. We disagree on some things, but he's really a genius. We love him. So with that said, thank you all. This hearing is adjourned.